Hi, this is Paul. This video is going to be long and rambly, but if you've watched my channel, that's how a lot of them are. Last week I did a conversation with Andrea and Ryan Bennett, and I thought it was an outstanding conversation. Andrea hurried up her process and posted it on her page, and as of when I took this little screenshot, 261 people have viewed it. I'll probably post it on my channel coming up sometime after this video, depending on sort of how the videos roll out in the spaces. The 20th century was a century of wars, bloodshed, but nationalism, mass movement, mass armies. The 21st century seems to be an age of mass micro. Social media putting people in little echo chambers, losing the ability to create stable, meaningful relationships across a myriad of different lines. Saw a friend of mine on Facebook posted that one of his, might have been a sister-in-law or someone, had unfriended him on Facebook because of the political chatter. And I see this commonly, especially on Facebook. Twitter can just be sort of a descent into flaming, but Facebook, the relational ties are more personal, and I've seen everybody just on Facebook morally posting for their side or getting defensive and doing real damage to relationships that should be more durable and more present in people's lives. So we did a Bridges of Meaning question and answer today. I wasn't real happy with how it went, so I might not post that one on my channel. We did record it, but I might not post it. Andrea then, in the Bridges of Meaning, asked a question she talked about on Twitter. There was a woman on Twitter who's living with her boyfriend, and she was attending I assume a Protestant or an evangelical church, and she was asked to step down from her volunteer job because she was living with her boyfriend. And so she took to Twitter to gain support, find people that would agree with her that the church was acting badly. And this raises all sorts of questions. Church discipline is at this point pretty much at a low spot. Churches live in terror of their membership, in some ways analogous to parents living in terror of the approval of their children. And so as a pastor, I'm not surprised that an evangelical church would ask a woman who was living with her boyfriend to step down, or marry her boyfriend and then be able to, in a sense, live as a respectable citizen in the church. But many look at that and say, sheesh, what's wrong with you? Everybody's living together. And it's true. Even despite the fact, which has been repeatedly announced by social sciences, that living together before marriage is a negative indicator of marital success. Jordan Peterson himself articulates it nicely. It's in a sense saying to the person you're living with, I love you enough to have sex with, but I'm not sure I want to spend the rest of my life with you. And it's often, not always, the men who sort of have a little cold feet, keeping their options open. It's very easy for men, especially in this age of birth control, to simply have serial girlfriends, go from one to another. All these girlfriends are sexual partners. Men can have a sex life that is meaningful or pleasing to them. And usually for the first number of decades, because men aren't on a biological clock, men just have a succession of women. Women, however, are on a biological clock. And I know a fair number of women that hit their mid-30s. They've lived with 2 or 3 men in their past, and none of those men proposed marriage. Or maybe the woman decided that, well, he was good enough to have sex with and share a house with and gain some companionship. But after a few months or years of living together, he wasn't what she was looking for. And then I see women in their mid-30s who are complaining about Their time is running out. Their clock is running. Their eggs are getting old. They want to have a family. They want to have a child, but no marryable man. But by the time they're in their mid-30s, their standards for a marryable man have gotten higher. If she's making six figures, she wants him to make six figures and then some. And there's all these kind of things that build into it. So then when a church kind of leans into this and says, you know, if you're going to live with your boyfriend, we're not going to let you be on stage with a microphone in your mouth singing, or we're not going to let you play music, or we're not going to even let you have this volunteer post. Well, what's the injury? She hasn't lost her job. The injury is really reputation and status. The church has, in a sense, told her, we have a standard and you're not measuring up, and so we might not bar you from communion. We might not bar you from services. We might not even engage in any formal steps of what would historically be formal discipline, but we're going to ask that you not do such and such a thing where you visibly represent the church, where it's public knowledge that you're, quote unquote, living in sin with your boyfriend, which may or may not be her fault. She may very much want to marry her boyfriend, but maybe the boyfriend doesn't want to marry, and maybe she's afraid that if she decides to withhold sex or to move out or something like this, that he'll just go back to the menu and find another woman who's probably a little bit younger, maybe a little bit prettier, maybe a little bit more desperate or not so smart, or horror of horrors, maybe he will in fact leave her and propose to someone else because he hits that point. And again, men usually hit this point later in life when they begin to say, maybe I would like a family, maybe I would like something beyond a sexual partner, maybe I would like something like this. But the church is very much caught in the middle. Now, of course, a much bigger fight is about same-sex marriage. And just recently in the Christian Reformed Church's denominational publication, the Banner has ran an article that Kneeland Avenue Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is every denomination has sort of its center and its periphery, and Classis Grand Rapids East is the center of the Christian Reformed Church. Many Christian Reformed institutions are there. Some of the oldest Christian Reformed churches are there. And Kneeland Avenue has decided to, obviously they kept this woman in the same-sex marriage in membership, but then they decided to ordain her as a deacon. And this obviously has significant symbolic impact on the denomination. And the denomination may, at this point, fight a war that people say nobody really wants. But then again, one side is looking for symbolic victories of liberation, and the other is looking for symbolic victories of, sometimes I told you so, vindication. And the CRC may very well descend into this fight. The question, of course, surrounds, is the sex of romantic partners or married persons incidental to the moral status and quality of the relationship? Does God view same-sex couples in the same light as God views heterosexual couples, all things being equal? Now, what's interesting about the church in these questions of whether it's premarital sex, cohabitation, same-sex attraction, there's a whole realm of issues here, not just same-sex marriage, is that while the church gets bombarded with the message, you've got to keep up with the times, you've got to keep up, you've got to continue to recalibrate and adjust your standards, people aren't exactly proposing what specifically is the new standard. Now, some would say, well, a continued exclusive lifelong relationship. How many people? Well, just two. Well, there's sort of a polarity with male-female that makes two a natural number. Once that polarity no longer holds, there's other questions that arise. And so the frontal assault on the church is, here is the new set of rules, is not undertaken because in many ways, once you start defining what those rules are, your coalitions break down almost immediately. And it's almost always implied that, well, everybody knows, but if you just kind of stop and pause and ask people for details where the lines are, not everybody knows. In fact, I've seen situations in churches where, let's say, there's a high-status single young man who is in the church singles group, and he is dating most of the women in the church, and he is having sex with most of the women in the church, and some of the women begin to complain that, well, he shouldn't just be going around having sex with these women. Okay, so, but you're saying premarital sex shouldn't be something that churches discipline over, so how often can he have sex a year? With how many women can he have sex a year? What kind of, well, there should be some kind of commitment. And if you watch, let's say, a television program like The New Girl, the contemporary script is sort of set that you meet someone, you have a date, at some point you have sex, and then it's while you're having sex with a person and maybe or maybe not cohabitating, maybe or maybe not dating exclusively. The women pretty quickly want exclusivity. The men often not necessarily. It's a stereotype, not always true. But, and then it's while they're in the middle of a sexual relationship, they're trying to sort out, well, how long-term will this be? They're trying each other on, but there's a cost to this trying each other on. What if he doesn't call me? What if he rejects me? What if he doesn't like me? And it's really sort of a mess. And in my meetups, my local meetups, one of the recurring topics of conversation is the inability of people to marry, to find a suitable marriage partner, to settle down, to begin that family. And as Jonathan Haidt mentioned in many of his videos, people are actually having less sex because even though there isn't this moral stigma that's cast over it, people are becoming increasingly aware of some of the natural consequences of this. But yet everyone would say, well, we don't really need to stipulate the rules. We all sort of know the rules, and I would argue you really don't. It's just a lot of fairly shallow thinking, and if you have enough relationships or see enough people or have enough people complain to you about what's going on in their lives, no, there aren't a lot of rules out there. Now, in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis had a very famous chapter on sex, where in many ways he sort of laid out the rules. He said, well, here in the church, it's really kind of clear. It's heterosexual, lifelong marriage only. That's where sex is intended. And most conservative churches have tried to at least formally maintain that standard, but to the degree to which they will insist or discipline varies widely. I know some pastors who, if the couple is living together, will only agree to marry them if, for example, they say they will abstain sexually for a while or move out of the house, while other pastors will just say, well, let's marriage is an improvement over what you're doing right now. Let's get her done. Now, Lewis was in some ways kind of a strange advocate for this. Lewis having been at least formally up front, a lifelong bachelor. But as many biographies will note, he had this strange relationship with Mrs. Moore, which many people believe was sexual, but that's not clear. Mrs. Moore was the mother of a World War I buddy. C.S. Lewis seemed to have a taste for bondage and some of that kinky stuff. Those are rumors as well. And then after he became a Christian and after he really tried to live according to not only the Christian standard, but also to live a life of mental, moral chastity, he was pursued by a married woman. And his relationship with Joy Davidman raised a lot of eyebrows. She was a married woman, and now she said she was fleeing her husband. But if you read a good biography of Joy Davidman, it was a pretty murky situation, and many of C.S. Lewis's friends weren't entirely happy with all of the decisions that Jack was making with respect to Joy Davidman. And then he agrees to this quiet immigration marriage to her when it was quite obvious to many people that she definitely was in love with him and definitely wanted more. In fact, she came to England to stalk him. And what exactly was going on in his mind with respect to this whole thing? And then, you know, when she falls ill, he decides that, well, he really would like a full-blown relationship with her, but now he's, you know, a Christian man in the church, and he doesn't feel right about having a sexual relationship with her, even though they're legally married in the eyes of in the eyes of the law, but not in the eyes of the church. And the first Anglican priest that he asks to marry them rejects him because the situation just has a lot of problems about it. And so he kind of hoodwinks another priest into it without fully disclosing, or maybe even lying, depending on which biography you read. And then they're married in the eyes of the church, and they go on to have, according to C.S. Lewis, a really amazing, wonderful relationship. She has a reprieve from her illness, but then her illness takes her, and he's completely crushed and writes A Grief Observed. Lewis's story should illustrate to probably anyone with any experience in a church where you actually know people's lives. This is a messy business. And although the Christian standard is clear, succinct, and broadly embraced, at least theoretically, it's notoriously aspirational. And many, many, many people fall short, not just with their mind, but also with their bodies. I remember one of my seminary professors talking about the fact that, you know, when you preach on the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, most preachers sort of begin to default to Jesus' standard of lust in your heart. And the seminary professor reminded us, you should also preach about regular adultery because it's not that uncommon. And so Christianity and this sexual standard is actually a very long and complex story, and I should probably make some more videos about it as I'm in the Mosaic Law right now and talk about it. Many will note that, well, if you read the sex lives of Old Testament heroes, things are complex. The Jews, although in many ways, especially in the Second Temple period, were outliers, there continued to be polygamy, there continued to be slavery, and the assumption is that there's probably, more than likely, as is often the case with slavery, sexual use and abuse of slaves. Of course, you get into the sex lives of the patriarchs, which I did a video of. Polygamy is common. Using slaves as child-rearing surrogates. We have surrogacy today, and we seem to be okay with it morally as long as there's consent and a contract and money changes hands. And I wonder if we've really thought that thing through. Jesus and Paul, of course, were, to the best of our knowledge, bachelors, and Jesus, as Jesus so often is, on one hand, sets a standard for Christian sexuality and marriage amazingly high, to the degree that his disciples, in exasperation, say, well, then who can marry? And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, well, who can see? And then you have the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul admonishing men in Corinth that they ought not to engage the services of prostitutes. And even though the Apostle Paul gets a bad rap amongst many people, he completely undermines Roman male sexual privilege and pushes towards equality between the sexes. Men, love your wives. And to us, that sounds just like, why would you even bother saying that? But in the Roman household, you didn't have to love your wife. She was the arrangements and managements of marriage were wholly different in the Roman Empire, were very different than they are today. And as some New Testament scholars have noted, one of the curious things about the New Testament is there's very little talk about sex and slavery and what those relationships were like, because in the Roman period, basically, masters had access to their slaves sexually. It was simply a given in the Roman Empire. So the Christian standard that we recognize today, which is at risk or undermined or interrupted by technology and such, was actually a very long time in coming. And again, Kyle Harper's From Shame to Sin. Notice Tim Keller in his review of Dominion bringing up Kyle Harper's work here. And even along the way, long a double standard for men, hence the utility of the word bastard. Marriage was in many ways the mechanism by which legitimate heirs would be secured. And many commoners throughout not only the Roman people, the Roman period, but then into the Middle Ages, common law marriage was very common. And in my work in the Dominican Republic amongst Haitians, I told the story in the question and answer today that in one very interesting Sunday, I didn't at the time recognize everything that was going on. I performed a wedding, a baptism, and an ordination of the same individual all that Sunday, all on the same Sunday. Well, why would that be? I performed a marriage for a man and a woman, and this man and the woman had been together for at least 20 years and had over a dozen children. And now we're marrying them? Well, why? Well, because basically the church in the Dominican Republic that I was working with had a rule, and its rule was that if you're going to be a minister in the Christian Reformed Church of the Dominican Republic, you had to be married to one wife. Now, you couldn't have a wife in Haiti and a wife in the Dominican Republic. You had to be married to one wife. Well, if they're Haitians living in the Dominican Republic, they have to have legal documentation to be legally married. And in fact, if you're going to be baptized, you should be legally married. And so this individual, at this late point in his life, he was older than I am, probably in his mid to late 40s. Again, having been with this, I don't know how many women he had been. I'd only been in the country a few years, but had, to my knowledge, over a dozen children with this one woman, and been together with her for many long years. Now finally secured legal documentation so that he could marry her, and hence, after his legal marriage to the woman that he was living with, be baptized as a legitimate Christian in the church, because he couldn't be their pastor if he wasn't baptized. But what was really going on there? He had actually been a preacher in that church for many, many years before I had gotten there and been well known, and everybody simply understood that this was his woman or this was his wife, but they couldn't be legally married, at least not in the Dominican Republic, and on and on and on and on. And then there were situations, one about the surest way to attack a pastor if you wanted to in the Dominican Republic was claim that he had a separate family in Haiti. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. And so, yeah, there's a lot going on with this, and there has been a lot going on with this, and there always will be a lot going on with this. And even though the formal standard that we have in the American church that C.S. Lewis notes was the standard embraced by the church in the Dominican Republic, everybody sort of understood that not everybody could live up to this standard, and so they made all sorts of accommodations for the people that couldn't. But that just opens the door to which standards do we accommodate and which standards don't we? You know, the moral status and stigma in the United States via the broad church participation and agreement to the standard, which really arose sort of in the 50s and 60s, the height of Protestantism, the height of church participation during the Cold War, well, it's always been aspirational. High status men, just count how many presidents in the mid and late 20th century had affairs. I mean, John F. Kennedy seemed to be something of a sex addict. They continued to be able to cheat, and the press would look the other way. Well, that has changed. Research the sex life of Donald Trump, if you will, on his third marriage. But ironically, these things don't seem to track along lines. You had Barack Obama, who seems to be an ideal and model husband, except for, every now and then sneaking a cigarette, but seems very devoted to his wife, Michelle, and a family man who, although Barack Obama's a moderate, is at least on the political side that wants to advocate libertinism. And Donald Trump, who has on his third marriage, and there are plenty of stories about him sleeping with porn stars and the like. Just if you can find a recording of Donald Trump on Howard Stern, hardly puritanical, yet he's over on the other side. So, yeah, it's a mess. It's a mess. A lot of this has come about, obviously, because of the 60s and the pill and the liberationist revolutions. And I really anticipate Tom Holland doing a book on the 60s. I'm very curious to see how he draws all this together. And, one of the really refreshing things I found about Jordan Peterson was his gutsy frankness with respect to what should have been things that you could say in public. What are the rules of men and women working together? What is lipstick and makeup and high heels about? What are suits about? What about Mike Pence and the Billy Graham rule? Why does Donald Trump seem to like to hire good-looking blonde women? On and on and on and on. And Jordan Peterson just sort of gutsy enough to ask questions that would offend both sides. We don't know the new rules. We walk around acting like we have rules, acting like we know rules, and we seem to punish people for violating rules all over the place, but where is the set of rules? We're making up these sets of rules as we go along, and there's no centralized authoritative institution that will actually write down the rules and agree upon them, especially when the rules are changing. Before one of my sons went to college, his basketball coach in the public school said to me and my wife, he didn't have any children, he wasn't even married, said parents should send their sons away to college with a big box of condoms and say, don't come home until you've used them all. That wasn't my position that I told my son. That was his position. He thought those were the rules. If you go to a public high school, you'll get a talking to about Title IX, where you have to get clear consent. And I suppose if someone really wants to stay out of court, get it in writing before each new boundary crossing event. But even where the boundary crossing events are isn't clear. Making a comment that so-and-so looks nice today. Well, that's a microaggression. You shouldn't be making any comment about my appearance, but not making a comment about an appearance might disappoint someone who has put a little bit of extra effort in looking their best because they know they'll bump into someone going to class. There are no rules out there, but everybody walks around imagining like everybody knows the rules. Come on. It's not true. So we don't know the long-term impacts of the pill. I really don't think we would be having the conversations about same-sex marriage if it weren't for the pill. Because I think Jordan Peterson is right that we have very little understanding the way the pill has changed our assumptions, not only about what sex is permissible or appropriate, but even our definition of sex. Bill Clinton, in his deposition, says, I did not have sex with that woman. Well, is oral sex sex? Why do we call it oral sex? It's because we don't want to use more graphic language. But, my wife was watching Schitt's Creek the other night, and the young woman of the family made a comment of, I won't even say the comment, but no, the rules are all over the place and nobody knows the rules. And the fact that nobody knows the rules doesn't mean that people aren't regularly denounced for violating rules that maybe not everybody is familiar with. And increasingly, in a land without lines, these things wind up in court. So we don't know the long-term impacts of these powerful forces. We don't know the new rules. We can't seem to sit down and figure them out, even if we try. And there are seemingly no authoritative bodies that could actually do things. And so these things then wind up in court. And, well, if we were to say that, well, we should make adultery a criminal charge. Do we really want the courts doing all this? In fact, no-fault divorces really got going because people didn't want all the dirty little details in court or having to force judges to make consequential decisions between formerly married people. So, in many ways, denominations are in disarray, and the ordination of this deacon at Neeland Avenue Christian Reformed Church is going to force some issues. And it sort of goes like this. You have a historic congregation at the denominational epicenter deciding to first ordain a lesbian deacon in a same-sex marriage. I don't know if she identifies as a lesbian or it's a deacon. I'll just leave it there. And inform the denomination about it. They consulted with their Classis. Their Classis has been having conversations with this since 2016. They consulted with the woman who teaches church order at Calvin Seminary, and now I think a lot of people didn't like the take that she had on it, but in all fairness to her, a lot of these things are sort of figured out in terms of case law. Because, as is the case of the American Congress with respect to laws about the internet, there are not enough because events seem to outstrip the capacity of the governing body. When it comes to these kinds of issues, churches don't have a lot of laws on the books. Although in the Christian Reformed Church, there's almost always one line that, well, something that disagrees with the Word of God, meaning the Bible. So that both keeps things very broad and also very vague when people are then arguing, well, what isn't in line with the Bible. So because you know you're never going to get your new rules passed, the legislative body, like the CRC Synod, you sort of play a game of chicken, which is more of a case law. And so this out of the Banner article, in taking this action, Neeland's council does not believe we have crossed any line of orthodoxy, only pastoral advice. The August letter reads, it describes their understanding that all synodical reports and decisions related to homosexuality have been pastoral advice given to churches, 1973, 2002, 2016, emphasis and parentheses original to the letter. Kathy Smith, Calvin Theological Seminary's adjunct professor of church polity, confirmed to the Banner that she explained the same in an adult education sessions at Neeland, noting that Synod 1975 consideration of the status of various types of synodical decisions and their relationship to the confessions. But at the same time, there was an incident with a church in Toronto when Synod basically told the Classis, no, you cannot have this openly gay elder in a same-sex relationship serve as elder, and the Classis conceded and the local church backed down. That's case law. You also have the fact that not too many years ago, Synod declared, because it was concerned about legislative rules after the 2013 decision, that churches might be sued if a church does not want to rent out its facility for a same-sex marriage unless the denomination has a clear statement on it. Christian Reformed churches might be subject to lawsuits, such as cake bakers or photographers or flower vendors, and so the denomination basically laid down a rule. Is it a pastoral advice? Is it a rule? These things are kind of vague in church order in some ways, but basically Christian Reformed ministers may not officiate at same-sex weddings. But yet Neeland says this, and a lot of people sort of read it and say, really? In 2016, there was a report that came to Synod that again asked for pastoral advice with respect to dealing with same-sex couples. And in the drama that goes on in synodical sessions, Synod decided to establish a study committee that could respond to this, but Synod decided to, by virtue of who got on the committee, make sure it would be a conservative report. And that, of course, drew fire, and that report is coming in 2021. So basically, the small affirming camp in the denomination knows it doesn't stand a chance of passing a vote on the Synod floor. So they go ahead and do what pretty much everyone would know is not permitted, to see if anyone dare discipline them. And the Classis that they're in, a vitally important Classis in the denomination, because Classis Grand Rapids East is where Calvin College is located, is where the denominational building is located, has some of the most important historic congregations of the denomination. In 2016, the Classis wrote a report, I'll put the link below, on biblical and theological support currently offered by Christian proponents of same-sex marriage. And so there are questions as to whether the Classis would discipline Kneeland Avenue. How can a Classis discipline the church? Classis can discipline a church basically by deposing all of their office bearers. Will Classis Grand Rapids East do that? And if Classis Grand Rapids East does not depose Kneeland, and Kneeland doesn't offer to back down, does Synod have the votes to depose, basically kick out, probably the most important Classis in the denomination? This fight basically has the potential of changing the Christian Reformed Church in a way that we probably haven't seen a church fight since the 1920s. So Synod 2021 then looms, and Synod 2020 was canceled due to COVID. What will be the case in 2021? Will delegates be able to assemble in Grand Rapids and meet in these tiny little chairs in this stuffed building? Will they all have to wear masks? Will they all have to say they've had a vaccine? Many conservative churches remain unhappy with a decision in the late 1990s allowing women elders and deacons and pastors. Moderate churches probably wouldn't want to affirm. In fact, Kneeland Avenue basically said maybe 40% of their congregation would like to affirm, and 40% is on the fence, and 20% is against. I would imagine that the numbers in the Christian Reformed Church are quite a bit higher in terms of being against this, but there are many moderate churches that might just want to say it's ugly and it's disastrous to discipline an entire Classis. Does Synod have the stomach for that? They might not agree with affirming, but what to do? And the 25-year war in the Christian Reformed Church over women in office, when you see WICO, that's, I'm just abbreviating women in church office, the 25-year-old battle had 70,000 or so people leave the Christian Reformed Church over that, and a new denomination was started, the United Reformed Church. And because the Christian Reformed Church basically decided to embrace a pragmatic compromise and said you can argue from Scripture either way, and so local church councils can decide as they will. And once there's a majority of local church councils, then a Classis can seat women elders and ordain women clergy. And once a majority of Classis do that, then women may be seated at Synod. And I believe it was Synod 2004, 2005 when women were first seated at Synod. Dissatisfaction lingers with this on both sides of the denomination. Kneeland Avenue is basically saying, well, we feel we should sort of push this, and that will bring resolution to this important issue, but the dynamics, the playbook is taken from the 1970s and 80s and how the women in office wars were fought, but it's a very different time, and those who remain in the denomination who are against women serving in office basically say we won't be fooled again, because even though it was said of the denomination that there are two positions which can be respected. A lot of conservatives don't feel respected. And a lot of conservatives note that it's almost impossible. When a car sits there with that. Okay, they're gone. Many conservatives say you don't see denominational leaders being elected unless they're in favor of women in office. And so conservatives can't get elected to high-ranking denominational positions. Many women feel that the playing field is not level. Many women who are candidates for ministry in the Christian Reformed Church have a much more difficult time becoming senior pastors or lead pastors or solo pastors in churches. Many churches that will permit women deacons and elders just feel more comfortable having a man as their senior pastor. And most of the denominational officials and seats in the denomination are held by men. And so basically both sides say the women in office compromise sort of leaves us in kind of a, just sort of took the heat out of the major debate and just made everything simmer for the last 25 years. The same-sex debate is by no means, will not play the same way. Also the fact that the Christian Reformed Church, like many denominations, has tried to be fairly aggressive in terms of racial diversity. And so the Christian Reformed Church is about 10% Korean. The Korean churches are very conservative. Many of the Hispanic and black pastors and churches are more conservative than the Anglo churches. And so what has become sort of a drumbeat on the left about racial diversity has in fact damaged their ability to pursue same-sex marriage affirmation in the denomination. And so, no, this is not going to play out like the 70s to the 90s and the fights over women in church office. To make this more complicated, there's the Reformed Church of America, which is our mother denomination or our sister denomination. The Reformed Church in America was a transplant of the Dutch state church, out of which the CRC ancestors in the Netherlands seceded. In the middle of the 19th century, the Christian Reformed Church in North America seceded from the Reformed Church in America. The Reformed Church in America came to the United States in the colonial period. It's the oldest European denomination in the Americas, if you don't count the Orthodox or the Roman Catholics as denominations. That's a technical question. In many ways, the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox are not considered to be denominations. Generally speaking, denominations are Protestants. So that gets into some nomenclature. But the Christian Reformed Church in North America succeeded in the United States in the mid-19th century and grew larger than the Reformed Church of America through Dutch immigration between the 1790s and 1910 and after the Second World War, to the degree that the Christian Reformed Church became a larger denomination than the Reformed Church of America. But the Reformed Church of America is a more diverse denomination theologically than the Christian Reformed Church. Some of those very old congregations and classes on the East Coast of the United States are pretty much mainline and have been struggling with mainline issues throughout their history. And so some of those RCA East Coast churches were very quick to embrace women in office, and some whole classes have been affirming in the Reformed Church of America. Some of the noteworthy historical pastors of the Reformed Church of America: Norman Vincent Peale, one of the collegiate congregations in New York City, Donald Trump's former church. There are many ironies in this entire story. Some of the Western congregations of the Reformed Church in America have been very evangelical or missional. Robert Schuller and the Crystal Cathedral were a Reformed Church in America congregation that began in a drive-in theater. Many of the Midwest congregations of the Reformed Church of America were similar to the Christian Reformed Church and fueled by Dutch immigration in the 19th and 20th century. And there's a smattering of RCA churches in Canada where there are many more Christian Reformed churches in Canada. But the mainline versus evangelical tectonic plate shifting that has been happening in these denominations, especially World War II, has been more dramatic in the Reformed Church of America. So basically you have very much mainline, small, dwindling, declining congregations in the RCA East, church planting, ethnic church planting, booming churches in the West that are very evangelical and conservative, some young, restless, and reformed, Acts 29 type network churches, those of you who recognize some of those labels, in the far West, and in the Midwest churches that are similar to the Christian Reformed Church. In many ways, watching the relationship between these two denominations, the Christian Reformed Church fights are almost always anticipated in the Reformed Church in America. It's sort of like watching the weather over the West Coast. Reformed Church of America polity was a little bit different from Christian Reformed polity, and whereas many of the churches in the Midwest and West were unhappy with these East Coast denominations affirming same-sex marriage and even ordaining gay and lesbian clergy in their denomination by virtue of the way that Reformed Church of America rules were fashioned. Even if they had majority votes in the Midwest and West, they couldn't discipline or kick out those classes or denominations. Over the last few years, the pressure from the Midwest and West to discipline the affirming churches on the East has grown as the Midwestern and Western churches, the conservative churches, have grown. The mainline-ish churches have declined, and so the power balance has been shifting. And as with the CRC, RCA efforts to enfold ethnic non-Anglo minorities has made the churches more conservative. And so RCA has had their own quite dramatic warfare over these issues for a couple of decades themselves. So the equations have changed. Now, the CRC and the RCA in recent years have been getting closer and closer together. An individual whose name you might recognize, Rich DeVos. Rich DeVos and Jay Van Andel grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. And in Western Michigan, the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church of America often overlap in different communities, and there's people go back and forth between them. Rich DeVos, before he passed away in 2018, you can find the video on the internet, declared publicly he was willing to use some of his fortune in his foundation to help the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church of America collaborate more. There were two efforts funded by the DeVos Foundation that, in fact, bought some of my time before I made YouTube videos, the Kingdom Enterprise Zone Project and the Reformed Leadership Initiative Project, which I worked with both. And so I worked quite closely with West Coast Reformed Church of America pastors and classes. Rich DeVos is he's deceased now, but his daughter-in-law is Betsy DeVos, who is, of course, the Secretary of Education in the Trump administration. And so, yes, these are quite the stories. And so over the last number of years, the CRC and the RCA have been talking merger, collaboration, benefits, denominational benefits, policies have sort of come together, health insurance, some of these things. Talk of merger made Reformed Church of America progressives nervous. What if this whole flood of CRC conservatives come in and tip the balance and kick out the RCA progressives? Talk of merger made CRC conservatives nervous. What if these more evangelical and mainline-ish RCA churches come in and change our political balance? Moderates from both sides, moderates from the RCA don't often see the CRC as a safe harbor because these fights seem to be just coming up later, and many of the RCA pastors say, why should we fight this fight all over again if we want to get out to the right of the denomination? To make matters even more complex, the RCA had a Vision 2020 team which was supposed to try to finally bring a solution to this. Solutions that might include breaking up the denomination. The Vision 2020 came basically with 3 options, which seemed fairly obvious to almost anyone what these 3 options would be. And a coalition of RCA churches that are quite evangelical in their orientation is basically saying, we'll preempt the split by maybe walking out as a group and forming our own, not really denomination, but association type thing. And our 4 main beefs are, we want a conservative biblical hermeneutic, we want traditional marriage, and the next one is a key one. We want freedom to either baptize or dedicate infants. That would be a deal breaker in the Christian Reformed Church. And we want radically reduced assessments. And RCA assessments, which are money that's sent up to the denomination to keep the denominational ministry going, are at far lower levels than they are in the Christian Reformed Church. Many people of color leaders in the denomination lean conservative, and due to social justice concerns have been continually giving an elevated voice, which has actually played in to this whole thing. And so some of you might have noticed a video on my channel a few months ago where some RCA congregations, in fact an entire Classis in the RCA in British Columbia, has been talking about merging with the 2 CRC Classis that are in British Columbia. And some CRC pastors saying maybe what we need is a big realignment. For any church that wants to be affirming or is okay in being a denomination with a local option and affirming, you can all move to the RCA. And any church in the RCA that doesn't want to deal with this affirming, you can all go to the more conservative CRCs. So CRCs that want to go affirming, move to the RCA. RCAs that don't want to be in a denomination that's affirming, you move over to the CRC, and there'll be a big swap, and then everybody will be happy. I'm doubtful, because there's a lot more that goes into this, and this will somehow lay the issue to rest. I don't know if there's any laying these issues to rest. Because is the LGBTQ question the only issue? Not really. What about women in office? The CRC and some RCA churches don't agree with women in office. Some do. You have churches that are against women in office and against affirming. You have churches that are not affirming of same-sex relationships, but for women in office. And then you've got churches that are for women in office and for same-sex partnerships and marriages. Social justice issue and critical race theory have now become hot-button issues, and I see these issues increasingly debated in the Christian Reformed Church now with the level of heat that before we've only seen with respect to women in office or same-sex marriages. Infant baptism is an issue that continues to linger, and this shows the broader evangelical perspective that says it really should be up to the parents if they want to baptize their infants or just dedicate their infant. Do what feels authentic to you. The Christian Reformed Church has tried to maintain a pretty clear line with respect to infant baptism, but there's some muddiness in those waters too. And so just because you resolve issues about same-sex marriage doesn't mean that these other issues are going away. You've got some real theological, confessional, and stylistic differences between American Evangelical, traditional Dutch Reformed, and the new Young, Restless, and Reformed, and the new and confessionalism between these groups. Neo-sacramentalism is rising. As I've said, many churches that were planted 20, 30 years ago in the seeker methodology have gone to more self-conscious liturgy and weekly communion and remembering your baptism and some baptismal water present, and churches that look sort of longingly at Anglican practice. And you know, pastors say to me, if the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox ever get together, I'm going with them. Mark Galli jumping to join the Roman Catholic Church. Even though it seems like the same-sex marriage question is the question. It's a symptom of far deeper things beneath. Then you've got institutional memory, institutional loyalty, identity, joint ministry. I think one big swap, rather doubtful. So CRC Voices is a little listserv that I've participated on for years, and one individual then writes this. So in my perfect world, here's what we do. A more progressive CRC joins with the more progressive wing of the RCA, maybe becoming the RCA, a benefit for the RCA. The more conservative branch, which I call the ultra-conservatives, join the URC, the splinter of the CRC that happened in the 1990s, which has the advantage of benefiting the URC as well. Yeah, but there are lots of other issues beneath the surface that CRC churches aren't paying any attention to. The moderate conservatives merge with the more conservatives in the RCA and perhaps retain the title of the CRC. And the new CRC RCA continues to share administrative structures and the like. So adding a little bit of resolution to the problems and joining the URC in. The URC is an affiliation, not a denomination. They can't really discipline each other. Well, another one of Alistair McGrath's books that has a tremendous title, Christianity's Dangerous Idea. There's corruption and tyranny in the Reformed Church, in the Roman Catholic Church, that leads to this political, religious, social upheaval that unsettles Europe. At the same time, the technological disruption of the printing press contributes to that. Martin Luther writes 95 theses in Latin, posts them to the door of the Wittenberg Church, expecting a vigorous conversation amongst church scholars, and a group of students translates it into German, turns it into a pamphlet, and distributes it widely, forcing the hand of the Roman Catholic Church to take stronger measures, in their mind remembering what had happened 100 years before with Jan Hus. But the printing press is now there, and the printing press will play a very big role in the Protestant Reformation. And you might say that the Protestant Reformation would not have happened if it were not for the printing press. I don't know that we'd have the same kind of denominational upheaval and disruption if not for the internet. Of course, Martin Luther, at this point, you have the psychological experience of faith. You have civil authorities that are just looking to not send so much money down to Rome and not have so much of their land be exempt from land taxes, land held by the churches. The civil authorities break away from the Roman Catholic Church and state churches start to develop. The Peace of Augsburg. Once you have state churches, this dangerous idea continues to go, and there's more people of consciences with more disagreements within the church, and they like to practice things in other ways, and they're reading the Bible in different ways, and so now you have dissenting communities forming in Europe. And you see in England, for example, the church keeps swinging between Anglican and Roman Catholic, but then you have all these dissenters. You have Methodists and Baptists and all of these new groups are rising, the Reformed churches. And they're organizing themselves sort of following the models of churches that they've seen. And they're distinguishing themselves with confessions that are written to differentiate between the different groups with respect to doctrine. And they're developing their own institutions to teach and promote these confessions and their particular beliefs. And then you have the American experiment, where you have American settlers motivated in the Massachusetts colony by religious zeal and freedom. And of course, you'll have Pennsylvania and Rhode Island and Connecticut. And then you've got the mid-America and southern colonies that are profit-seeking with tobacco. Tobacco is the great world drug and can't get enough of it. And so there has to be legislation in these colonies to tell people to grow food because you just make a lot more money growing tobacco. But people need to eat. And of course, slavery, you've got the story, read 1493, you've got slavery starting partly because of mosquitoes and everything that happened. White indentured servants from Europe who are paying their way with their years of labor on a tobacco plantation. Well, they die too quickly of malaria, and Africans from West Africa have malarial resistance, and they continue. And, well, now there's a motivation to keep them in perpetual slavery, not just indentured servitude, given the fact that they didn't sign a European legal contract to get over. They were purchased from other Africans as slaves and carted over and sold. Also in terms of the slavery going on in the Caribbean and South America. Well, in the colonies, you have religious liberty because the Quakers can't get along with the Anglicans in the South, or, the few Catholics that have come over, or the Puritans. Or so if they're going to make that union work, they're going to have to agree to not talk about all these confessional differences in America. And most of the founding fathers, again, I recommend this book by David Holmes, The Faiths, plural, of the founding fathers. Many of them are deists, and they say, well, religion is a productive thing, and we want to see churches established and people having religious ideas, but George Washington was not confirmed. Benjamin Franklin had his own ideas. Thomas Jefferson edited his own Bible. So you have this philosophical motivation of the Enlightenment poured into it, and you had the birth of the secular, the church's sister, the secular state, the secular federal government. You continued to have state churches into the early part of the 19th century in the United States. You had Quakers, you had Roger Williams, you had Dutch tolerance, learned by Roger Williams in the Netherlands, and you had Puritan rules, and you had Dutch Reformed churches in that mix too. But secularism eventually won the day, and religious liberty won the day, and Christian communities proliferate, and religious market dynamics begin to take hold. And whereas over the long course Europe would get more secular, religion would flourish in the religious marketplaces of America. Mark Knoll's excellent document, which is no longer on Biologos, to my disappointment, about the westward expansion, the conquest and colonizing of the West. Western settlers basically outpaced European churches. If you know anything about the move over the Appalachians and the move into the Louisiana Territory and the move over the Mississippi, almost always opportunistic, ambitious Americans were looking to get out ahead of what the federal government wanted to do. The federal government had to try to at least keep peace with the indigenous population, but people wanted land, and the Wild West was called wild for a reason. And when people went out there, well, those European churches couldn't keep pace, and so you had circuit riders. But what basically happens is that there's a certain allegiance to the Bible becomes a sacrament of sorts. And this takes deep root in the American religious experience. You have the rise of American indigenous denominations and sects, like the Mormons and the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses. You have the religious marketplace dynamics taking off and strengthening. Now, immigrants settle west too, like Dutch immigrants from the Netherlands in the middle and the end of the 19th century. And you have both state churches, the Reformed Church of America, and dissenting churches, the Christian Reformed Church, and they are duplicating their old world fights, and they're duplicating their old world structures. And so, for example, the church order of the Christian Reformed Church for many years was simply a translation of the one used by similar churches in the Netherlands. But you have immigrant dynamics creating new denominational bonds and dynamics. Martin Marty, a church historian, journalist, is reported to have said that the Christian Reformed Church is not a denomination. It's an extended family. And for many in the Christian Reformed Church, that's true. Institutions buffered immigrant shock and perpetuated confessional traditions with transplanted cultures. In the 1970s, there was a very famous article in the Banner, the official magazine of the Christian Reformed Church, with Andrew Kuyvenhoven, a Dutch immigrant himself, a post-World War II Dutch immigrant, advocating, a Canadian, many of the banner editors have been Canadian, advocating that the CRC in North America finally burn the wooden shoes. Became a landmark banner editorial and something which has continued to be remembered. How culturally Dutch do you have to be part of the Christian Reformed Church? And obviously my own story in terms of my father's church in Paterson, New Jersey, in a predominantly black community, really weighs into those dynamics. Americanization of formerly European churches continues, and if anything prompted that, it was the American Civil War, which split churches north and south over the issue of slavery. Again, you can find a really excellent book by Mark Knoll, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, goes into these issues as they played out in the Civil War. Forces that are uniquely American continue to differentiate from transplanted European ideals. And in the 19th century, Roman Catholic immigration through the Irish and the Italians and other immigrant groups begin to change the political, religious landscape in North America. And many of these immigrants went to cities, and so urbanization becomes a picture of this. 19th and 20th century, we really have the rise of markets and zeal. Protestant psychological immanentism. You're going to have a sawdust revival where the minister is going to put you on the anxious bench and get you to make a confession for Jesus Christ. You have flexible, pragmatic, nimble institutions winning souls for Jesus all throughout the United States. You have traditions in competition for adherence. What churches will grow? The Methodists grow. The Southern Baptists grow. Many of these younger denominations that were minority dissenting churches that were out in the cold in Europe, come to America and grow like wildfire with adapting quickly to the religious norms that are going on. You had frontier biblicism. You had the Bible as a sacrament. You had urbanization of the frontier spirit. Billy Graham, in many ways, an evangelical from the South, storming major American cities, filling baseball stadiums with many, many people coming to make a confession of Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. Charismatic leaders, the rise of the charismatic movement. Business institutions serve non-denominational and older congregational churches. The American church situation changes. Denominations before the World War II. Here's a picture of the Calvin Seminary class of 1932. My grandfather got all of his classmates to sign it. And so, of course, the only picture not signed there is the picture of my grandfather in that graduating class. My grandfather, little did we know, the son of Jewish immigrants who decided to be Dutch for one reason or another. I don't know how Dutch some of their wives were, but when they came to America, became Dutch Reformed. But you were Christian Reformed, and to go to the Reformed Church of America, well, you might be, hazarding eternal damnation to go to the RCA back in those days, but you certainly would never go to the Roman Catholics or even to a Baptist group. Denominations embodied brands and identity that embodied culture, confessional identity, and community norms. There's quite a bit more commonality between denominations than denominations like to imagine, but there's a lot going on there. Afforded institution building and propagation of religious culture to successive generations. The goal, the Christian Reformed Church, you would first found the Christian Reformed Church in a community, and once you had 2 or 3 of them, you would found a Christian school, and that way you would make sure that all of your youth not only received catechesis in the church, but all of their other education from the church, although in the Kuyperian vision, the church was run by parents and not by clergy. But what that meant was that CRC kids married CRC kids. And so denominational institutions like Calvin College, a major function of a place like Calvin College was so Christian Reformed youth could mingle with Christian Reformed youth and have Christian Reformed babies and keep all of us in the Christian Reformed Church generation after generation. That all gets changed by the Second World War. After the Second World War, GIs discover that, boy, these Baptists and these other Christians, there's a lot of commonality, and you have denominations soaring during the Cold War. American church attendance reaches its peak, and so evangelism in North America is to bring people who are culturally Christians into the church. And here's a little picture of the promotional material of my father's Northside Chapel. Chapels in the Christian Reformed Church were not organized churches. They were sort of experimental congregations where the rules were a little bit looser and you could sort of play by different standards and, you know, trying to reach out to non-Dutch people. But this whole promotional thing where my father is a young minister reads very mid-century modern. Even the architecture of the church that the surrounding Christian Reformed churches built are very mid-century modern. And so you're enfolding inactive social Christians through promotional materials, through educational institutions. Denominations are paying more and more attention to health and retirement benefits. Denominations are working towards world evangelization and church planting. Denominations are getting into relief and development institutions. Many of the Christian Reformed agencies, Back to God Hour, started during the Depression era when radio ministry was hot. You see denominations all across the board starting their own radio ministries. The Reformed Church of America had distinct organizations from the Christian Reformed Church, often mirroring them. The Christian Reformed Church, with its cultural and family cohesion, tended to have an easier time founding bigger organizations than the Reformed Church of America. And so Christian Reformed World Missions get started on the world evangelism wave of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Radio ministry, when radio come on board. The 1960s and 70s, Christian Reformed World Relief Committee, now World Renew. Relief and development organizations start in the 60s and 70s. Denominations sort of in isolation, but all doing these things sort of at the same time. A post-colonial, neo-anti-colonial liberationist movements of race and sex and class going through denominations. And then, of course, the 1980s, you have the culture war. You have the beginning of the implosion of the mainline as these liberation movements are tearing mainline churches apart. The rise of the neo-evangelical and church growth movements. Church growth that says birds of a feather flock together. So target church music and church culture specifically to hit certain cultural segments. Basically, you run a church the way radio stations run. Get them in with the kind of music that they like, give them the kind of preaching that they'll be most susceptible to, and you can grow a big church fast. Use business techniques to grow these big churches. And many of these big churches are non-denominational because they find the rules that denominations have that bring them back to the early part of the 20th century or even the 19th century overly restrictive. So you have the mobilization of conservative Christianity as a political movement in the 1980s, the moral majority. You have the rise of the seeker movement, again, pragmatic church growth movement, which changes the landscape and dots America either full of non-denominational churches or denominational churches that are hiding their denominational relationships. And then after the seeker movement, you have the emergent movement, which sort of splits, sort of between New Age progressive Protestants and young, restless, and reformed Protestants. But over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen the decline of denominations. Immigrant cultures have been weakening. Americanization has been continuing. Confessional identities have been disrupted. Why are we going to fight over infant baptism and a bunch of these things that denominations carved out in the early 20th and late 19th century? Many of these denominations having been founded in the fundamentalist modernist split or even earlier in the Civil War splits. American pragmatic pressures make old European confessional agendas seem obsolete. No creed but Christ. We're a Bible-believing church. We just believe what the Bible says. We don't need all those creeds and confessions on top of it. We just believe the Bible. New issues arise. Institutionalization forms around them, but institutions themselves have changed. This is a picture from the Willow Creek campus. The Willow Creek Association and many other associations emerged that sort of bring denominational and non-denominational churches under these same association umbrellas. You could go to the Willow Creek Conference. You could go to the Willow Creek Leaders Conference, and for $100 or $200 a year, your church could be part of the Willow Creek Association, and you would receive a cassette tape, later a CD, every month with a little lesson given by Bill Hybels or one of his staff. And in many ways, there were churches that were in the Willow Creek Association had more in common in certain aspects than those churches had with their denominational partners. So like church participation is voluntary and purchased, usually at quite a bit lower level than denominational assessments. And so when you see this big group of RCA churches looking to sort of hive themselves off, kind of looks like they'll become something like the Willow Creek Association was in its heyday. You have independent publishing houses like Group Publishing creating broadly evangelical vacation Bible school and Sunday school material. Cook Publishing. Some of these publishing houses grew out of denominational publishing, but as the denominations declined, these publishing houses realized the only way that they could succeed was by selling to other evangelical groups. Christian schools in the Christian Reformed Church have been doing the same thing. Christian colleges have been doing the same thing. So there's a lot going on in these spaces as the denominations break down. Celebrity pastors like Bill Hybels and Rick Warren and Tim Keller and on you can go through the list. Celebrity pastors have more influence than denominations in terms of the pastors' minds. Pastors are every week listening to a new tape by Bill Hybels. That's before we had the internet, remember? Now we have YouTube to listen to Paul Vanderklay, celebrity pastor though he is. Celebrity pastors have more influence than denominational traditions in this active marketplace of ideas and institutions. But these new forms of association expose weaknesses. There's no accountability like denominations used to have. And so, ironically, as there's both a demand for sexual liberty, at the same time, there's an increasing demand for sexual accountability on church leaders. These things are rising at the same time, and people don't recognize the kind of cross pressures. So, in other words, we want sexual liberty for everyone, but would you really want your pastor dating, would you really want your bachelor pastor just going through the congregation dating single women? Each generation, them being a little younger. Is that what you want your pastor to look like? A lot of people would say, well, I don't think people should be disciplined for living with their boyfriend or girlfriend or having premarital or extramarital sex as long as everyone's a consenting adult. But I don't want my pastor doing it. Why? Because the pastor's holding a symbolic position. And these symbols continue to have purchase on people's imaginaries. There is not a new set of rules yet. There's very shallow theological reflection. Many of these associations are quite pragmatic. We'll show you how to grow your church big, but we're acting not only like the sexual norms are assumed, but the theological norms are assumed. In fact, you can plug and play, go with infant baptism or not infant baptism, women in office or not women in office, affirming same-sex couples, not affirming same-sex couples. Plug anything you want as long as you understand how to have your music fit your radio demographic, so you can, well, eventually can what? Churches like the Southern Baptist, Rick Warren, Saddleback, or the non-denominational. Bill Hybels grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, but his message was broadly evangelical, and they borrowed the 4 spiritual laws and these evangelical staples. But then when women in office came along, well, who decides whether or not Willow Creek is going to affirm women in office? Well, the decision was made that they would. And so they sort of look like the moderate progressive wing of the Christian Reformed Church, but they're successful, whereas Christian Reformed churches are not. So at the expense of Christian Reformed Home Missions in the 1990s, I went to Willow Creek 2 or 3 times and learned from Bill Hybels and all of those things. I never proved to be a very successful church growth pastor. Went to Saddleback a couple of times and actually learned a lot, but learned a lot about a lot in these meetings. And Yeah, there's sort of a shallow theological reflection. Theology is flexible. What's really important is getting more souls for Christ. That's an evangelical theological formulation. And you have this chaotic and erratic faddishness. Whereas the Christian Reformed Church is a fairly young denomination, only being around a little over 150 years, Willow Creek Association rises and falls within just a matter of years. There's a transactional relationship with these affiliations that, well, should we re-up our Willow Creek Association membership this year? Well, it only costs $250. But now we used to get the tapes and then the CDs, but now I can go on the internet with Google and I can listen to whoever I want to. And in fact, I'll have the Google algorithm pick who I should listen to now. I mean, all this stuff is changing. And we're a little drowsy and unaware of the deep ways that this is changing church at its very foundation. There's an instrumentalism. Well, what is the goal? Well, for many evangelical churches, it's getting more people to make a confession to Christ. But after they make a confession to Christ, what does that mean in terms of their sex life? Well, how can we talk about it? Is it whatever feels authentic to them? Well, what about where they're at in terms of white privilege and Black Lives Matter and how do we navigate these things when, well, whether or not you allow a woman to be behind the pulpit, that might split your church. So you say, well, that's incidental. Okay, well, maybe the woman behind the pulpit is married to another woman. Is that incidental? And can people actually explain why they think one is and why they think one isn't? And with whom are they going to try to work through these issues? Well, again, if you read, it's on my little short list of books here, if you read Christian Smith, Soul Searching, well, people's minds are made up before the preacher even opens a word, and they say, well, it's just obvious that women should be allowed to be pastors. It's just obvious that women shouldn't be pastors. It's just obvious that this wonderful couple down the road that just happen to be gay and they tithe and they come to church and they volunteer and their adopted children are so, it's just obvious that they should be allowed to have full participation in the church. Well, it's just obvious that they shouldn't because they're breaking God's norm. God's, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And it's just obvious. But if you try to push people a little bit further into it's just obvious, well, then the second level is all the usual arguments, which may or may not be good and may or may not be right. But after people have heard those arguments, well, then their mind is made up and we're done talking. And now what? Well, we'll be non-denominational, but then you got to look for a new pastor. And, well, your non-denominational church is kind of subject to whatever that particular pastor thinks is right. And, well, you're just asking for all kinds of things. So now come 2020 and there's a hunger for fixedness. And part of that is beneath the neo-sacramentalism that we see going on. So, is going back, moving forward? Mark Galli, former Christianity Today editor, former Presbyterian minister, and Trump critic, got into trouble with some of his base on his way out the door, writing that editorial about Trump. Becomes a confirmed Catholic. Is he a Joe Biden Catholic? What kind of a Catholic will he be? Is he a Pope Francis Catholic or is he a Benedict Catholic? Understand the impulse of looking for that fixedness. There's plenty of diversity in these ancient structures. And look at my conversations with Roman Catholics. They've got plenty of fights. They just sort of, do they stay in the denomination? Do they consider themselves Catholic even if they're not going to Mass? Or do they pick and choose which bishop or which diocese or which priest? And, well, that's looking pretty Protestant-ish. Just listen to Bishop Barron. We have a word for that. Protestant. Ooh. Protesting inside or out. Part of what we're dealing with is there is no structure large enough, no authority bought in enough No one has a corner on the mass media to rewrite the sexual playbook. A wonderful book by Melinda Selmis, who is a gay woman who is trying to live according to Roman Catholic teaching, and a searingly honest book, an intimate reflection on homosexuality and Catholicism. And if you're curious about this question, I recommend reading her book. It's startling in many ways. Can one church lead on these issues? Can one pope lead on these issues? Can one denomination lead on these issues? Can one celebrity pastor lead on these issues? And again, this stuff all then gets kicked into the criminal justice system. Does it belong there? Does it belong in, do we really want our government legislating our sexual behavior? No, we want liberty. But Mike Pence should have lunch with women. The Roman Church has tried, but a minority of North Americans finds their vision compelling, including various presidential candidates like Joe Biden and John Kerry. Should they receive communion? Joe Biden is a Roman Catholic. Amy Coney Barrett, Trump's likely nominee for the Supreme Court, is a Roman Catholic. Amy Barrett's Catholicism is a problem when she was at a Senate confirmation hearing not too many years ago. Fair amount of men mansplaining her about a number of things, I noticed. Some of the women senators going after her pretty hard. They don't seem to be worried about Joe Biden's Catholicism. What's going on with all of these kinds of things? Now, there will have to be a new assessment of denominations, and that's happening. And it's happening with people's feet and people's actions. So, people at Neyland Avenue could say anything that they wanted, but when they take action, it impacts the symbolic realm in the symbolic imaginary in the Christian Reformed Church. And, well, now will the denomination go to war? Will everybody line up their most conservative, reliable votes to go to Synod 2021? And will they vote to order Classis Grand Rapids East to discipline, to basically say to Neyland Avenue, unordain, we don't have a form for unordaining, have that deacon resign, or else we kick out Neyland Ave. And if Neyland Ave doesn't go, we kick out Classis Grand Rapids East. What happens to all those denominational employees that, by virtue of their job, they need to be members of the Christian Reformed Church and ordained in the Christian Reformed Church, if their Classis gets kicked out of the denomination? Or all those Calvin College professors who sign their own version of the covenant of office bearers by which they subscribe to the doctrinal standards of the Christian Reformed Church. What happens to them if their Classis gets kicked out of the denomination? What happens if Church of the Servant or Eastern Avenue or Sherman Street? Now, most of those names don't mean anything to you, but they mean a lot to some people. What happens if they all get kicked out of the denomination? There's no roadmap for this. This could happen. We don't know. We're all in unmapped territory here if you're in the Christian Reformed Church. So maybe we take a step back and ask ourselves some basic questions. What do we need from our structures? What do we need from our networks? What sort of relationships do we need moving forward? We have whole ranges of aspects of our lives that have been rapidly disrupted, and we expect, or don't expect, churches to afford wisdom on these matters. And because of the political nature of many of these matters, we can't have productive conversations, and all we have are these shouting matches. And it's a problem. And it's a problem that's going to cost people's jobs. It's a problem that are going to cost people relationships. It's a problem that is going to destroy churches and denominations. Do we have what it takes moving forward to actually be able to address these things? Part of what we need, and denominations have offered, not always well, are confessional communities. This is, in a sense, how denominations get started. We need people with whom we have a basis of agreement in order to talk through issues that we have. Confessionality is not going away. but it's in many ways on the American landscape pushed by evangelicalism. It's been unattended because we don't want to have a fight over infant baptism if we think the evangelization of North America is most important, because our churches are declining to the degree that we won't have churches anymore, and we won't have pastors anymore, and we won't have Christian schools anymore, and. So the major thing was trying to not get swept away in the rise of the nuns and to try to keep our churches alive. Now we're going to have a fight over women in office or infant baptism or gay and lesbian people? No, let's just paper over these things until, of course, there's an issue that we can't agree on easily. Or is the cutting edge of our church, is our church's mission really about winning souls for Christ? Or is it about reducing racism and bringing justice into the world? Which mission is it? You're not going to have a denomination really going in a compelling way, or an association of churches. The Willow Creek Association was to bring a safe space to bring a dangerous message, but safe space meant a very different thing. They wanted to be compelling churches. They wanted to be winning souls for Christ. That's at the heart of the Willow Creek Association. But, well, maybe a little bit of, anti-racism stuff there, but what about when anti-racism and sexual liberation and social justice and sexual justice and economic justice and immigrant justice become the burning hot issue in your church? Well, maybe you should join a mainline. Well, okay, but they're falling apart. What if your issue is really feeding off the other churches and converting people whose primary orientation is winning souls for Christ, but trying to wake them up to all the justice issues? Well, it's really hard to have two focuses. So you need a confessional community to work through, to figure out the hierarchy of these issues and how they actually merge together. And, well, we don't want racist churches winning souls for Christ. And many churches that are trying to be anti-racist don't necessarily want to give up imagining that Christianity has something to say about what happens after you die. So you need a confessional community, collaboration with a like-minded community that can have productive conversations and doesn't devolve into bitter fights. In many ways, some of the churches that want to leave the RCA say, we want to talk about something other than these issues. And that's only going to happen if we, without resolving these issues, cut it off. That's what the CRC tried to do with women in office. Hasn't necessarily gone that well. You have a community narrative identity because these issues impact your identity. You have cooperative institutions cultivating and supporting leadership. Where are you going to get your clergy from? Where are you going to get your training materials from? Who are the thought leaders in your tribe that you all can agree to listen to? Or maybe that day is done and we're just out there on YouTube and podcasts from now on, or reading what Zondervan's or Erdman's. Zondervan's, of course, is bought by a major publishing house in America. That NIV money was just too important to bypass. Or you're going to get your material from Word, or you're going to get your material from Crossway, or. And then these issues sort of boil down then into the publishing house level, in the broadly evangelical marketplace, instead of the denominational level. You have questions of credentialing, questions of confessional promotion, questions of collaborative educational development, questions of particularized confessional theological education. So the Christian Reformed Church owns Calvin Theological Seminary, and Calvin Theological Seminary is a core piece of the sustaining of the Christian Reformed confessional community. What happens if that goes away? What happens if, well, when I was at Calvin Seminary, the fight over women in church office was hot at the seminary. In the early part of the 20th century, half of the seminary was dismissed over certain theological issues. You need a confessional community where you can productively discuss what can we agree on, what can we be held accountable to, where will the lines be drawn in our church. And so the 2021 sexuality pastoral guidance on Same-sex marriage report coming from a conservative, a hand-picked conservative group in the denomination. But because it was hand-picked, will the other side even bother listening to it? Or will it be dead on arrival? Or will it seem like it's coming out of an echo chamber and people can read it in the church and be satisfied, but their neighbors aren't going to understand it? Business management is something that denominations do. That in some ways is the easiest part. To run a pension fund or a healthcare program or something like that. Technical advice and support for web distribution. Makes sense of economies of scale, but maybe there'll be evangelical vendors out there or mainline vendors out there who, because of their economy of scale, make it more meaningful for denominations to just buy their stuff on the open market. Collaborative projects like missions. Again, this is very old. Joanna Veenstra, her picture here. Joined Sudan United Mission. Came from Hopper Street, Patterson, New Jersey. It's an interesting story. George Marsden writes about the soul of the American university. Christian colleges have sort of become an epicenter of many of these issues. And whether or not Christian colleges moving forward with a Democratic administration will be able to participate in the federal student aid programs, well, depends on what the next Democratic administration does with Title IX. These issues are coming down to things, and denominations are pretty much in panic. The CRCNA's educational institutions, only one is owned by the denomination, Calvin College, but CRC schools have long been run by parent groups. And what that means is that they are increasingly at the will of broadly religious marketplaces, not a confessional, coherent denomination. If I were to reconstruct a denomination, my ecumenical efforts would probably be different from the kind of things we saw birthed in the 20th century, which have rather esoteric conversations over theological fine points with the hope of unification. I would rather have more open communications. Why? Because if churches are going to have a compelling, viable witness, they're going to need to be up to speed on the assumptions and the thoughts of their increasingly diverse communities that they're participating in. And so ecumenical conversations focused on formal reunification, they've been pretty much what's been there, but that project seems too ambitious when almost all of these structures of denominations are under great stress. When they all seem to be at the mercy of far larger cultural forces. Even many within the churches are unconvinced of their teachers and the teachings of their churches. They're unable or unwilling to discipline their people. And even just asking a woman you're living with your boyfriend, that's against our community standard. Why don't you not hand out bulletins on Sunday morning or be a parking lot greeter? What, because I'm living with my boyfriend? Yeah. Well, I'm offended that you would get into my private business. Is that going to be the line for churches? The complaint against churches and denominations is that they have all these esoteric beliefs out there that don't relate to people's lives. So when they finally get into people's lives, well, don't get into my life in any way that I don't want you to. Okay. But do relationships really work that way? Maybe there's a reason you're not married. With social media enacted, the enacted vision will need to be visibly superior to the rivals and detractors. Churches are going to need to get their acts together, and their membership are going to have to live with a degree of accountability with respect to the lifestyles they choose. Rod Dreher's been writing about this in his Benedict option. His vision is that there'd be all these tiny little communities doing that. Well, those tiny little communities are at some point going to have to talk with people they agree with and talk with people they don't agree with, and figure out ways to develop the kinds of leaderships that can see through these knotty issues. That may happen if a level of chaos continues to escalate, but we need structures and places where, unlike tribes, can engage the questions productively, and all sides need this. Could this be a new aspect of an ecclesiastical structure? I don't know, but the basic questions that we're dealing with: how will the church get through these things? How will the church be able to answer these questions? Can the church find answers that they can agree upon, at least in significant sized groups, and that people can find things that they're willing to be held accountable to? That's the question. And that question goes down into this Twitter conversation about, how dare that church tell me I can't volunteer in the church anymore if I'm living with my boyfriend? How dare that church differentiate between this deacon who is more than capable of collecting the offering and managing the church budget and attending to the poor and the suffering in the neighborhood? Isn't that her job? Does it matter if she's married to a man and the woman in terms of how she does her job? Can a church answer these questions? Can a church answer these questions in ways that maybe not everybody will like, but the answer is at least compelling and understandable? Is there a space where these answers can be brought down enough into an intelligible space where people might not like it, but they can say, I can understand why your organization has a degree of accountability around these things? This is where denominations are at. It's not just theoretical for people like me. It's part of the reason I have my channel. It's part of the reason I talk to you folks. It's part of the reason I listen to you folks. Because if we can't figure out where to get a common language and be able to present vision in a compelling way, then we're not going to have structures. And if we're not going to have structures, then we're just all kind of bobbing along, making stuff up, and then you've pretty much just got chaos. So I don't know if this video will appeal to anyone. Maybe it's just another one of my long, rambly videos. But based on the question and answer today and what's going on in my denomination, I thought I'd at least get some of this off my chest. Thanks for listening.